In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna bid on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
Welcome to the Legacy of Agriculture. This program will explore the past, present, and future of agriculture. We'll look at the people, products, and events that have formed its history. And now with today's guest, your host, Chris Bear.
Good Saturday morning, folks. This is Josh with the Legacy of Agriculture. I am not your normal host. Normally, Chris Bear is hosting this Saturday morning program, but we are actually pre-recording, and Chris, a good friend of mine, has allowed me to guest host this program. And in guest hosting, I've been able to invite a good friend of mine down to WNAX Studios, and that good friend of mine is Kendal Zylstra. Kendal, say hey to the radio, bud.
Hi, good morning, everybody.
So, Kendal, the reason I asked you in here is because, like me, you are a good Dutch boy. You're from the Iowa side, I'm from the South Dakota side, and we're both Vans, just each of us on our mother's side. So my mom is a Van Dam over from Minnesota, and your mom, I believe, is a Van Rolte. Am I saying Rolte correct? Yeah?
We usually go Ralty, but that's close enough.
Okay, yeah, awesome. Well, hey, with those Dutch names, I can get them wrong from time to time. So, but yeah, we grew up together, Kendal and I. We've been good friends since middle school into high school. And Kendal has a lifelong experience in agriculture. His family is from the town of Larchwood, and they've farmed the same plot for nearly a century, but not quite a century farm for reasons we're going to get into in this program. But one of the things we'll talk about a little bit is Kendal's history, as well as Kendal's political career. Kendal Zylstra is my age, which for those of you who aren't watching on YouTube is pretty young. We're both about 25, though maybe I feel a little older at times. So, no, we're just going to sit down and have a cup of coffee and talk about what it's like to be a young person, both in agriculture and in politics. Before we get started, I do want to offer that disclaimer that the Legacy of Agriculture is a political show. That means whether you are right, left, or center, we don't care. But we're going to talk a little bit about what that means for folks in agriculture, some of the issues that Kendal sees that are affecting us, and what that looks like today. So, Kendal, let's get started just talking about your family farm. So you grew up on a farm. It wasn't like you lived in town and moved to the farm. You were on a farm since you were able to remember, correct?
Yeah, that's right. My grandparents farmed our farm until I was, probably about 10 or 11 years old, and then we moved to the farm. But growing up, we lived on an acreage just a couple miles down the road, and that's where I spent my growing up years.
Gotcha. So you were the helping hand for Grandpa and Grandma then, I suppose.
Yes. And I have a lot of fond memories of spending time with my grandparents as well as my parents, and it was always just a full family affair.
Okay, yeah. I gotta ask you though, what is some of the jobs that little Kendal was doing on the farms for Grandpa and Grandma? Because you see, my grandpa owned a farm, but I lived in town, and I'm the youngest of four boys, which means I got very, very good at that game of pick up nails. When it was time to run the tractors,
Right.
That was the older siblings. But
Right.
you're the oldest,
Correct.
which means you might have actually been able to be running the machinery.
Yeah. I've never been like the most coordinated person, and I think my grandpa was definitely one of those where he'd rather do a lot of things himself. So it was really kind of more supervising and kind of doing the little things, running, grabbing this thing there, that sort of thing. So as a young kid, you're just kind of hanging out, right? I would say 3 or 4 year old me probably wasn't as helpful as 13 and 14-year-old me. But I think just being around it is what really helps, right? Some people that I've talked to that maybe weren't exposed to the farm until a later age, they didn't really kind of have that background, right? You kind of have to be able to speak the language and really be immersed in that culture. And I was just so blessed to be able to be a part of that from a very young age, from as early as I can remember.
I definitely agree with you there in that I know for a fact that my grandpa's tractor, it didn't have one of those buddy seats, right? But it had a cab, so you got used to sitting on the fender of the tractor within the cab, right?
Right.
And it's not quite the same as maybe riding on the fender of the tractor, maybe a hair safer, but it's still, you learn a lot just being able to sit and look out at the fields and talk about what harvest means, and I have this story of my own grandfather. We were riding down in a pickup, and I'll tell anybody who will listen to me talk. at the time I was in high school. Now, again, I grew up in town, and I was one of those city kids who thought, oh, the Midwest, this place, I just got to get out of here. I got to go where there's scenery, right, and where there's things to do. And I was riding along in the pickup with my grandfather, and he pointed out the corn was coming up. It was just starting to tassel, right, and it was we were riding down the road, and he says to me, that to me, and he points out at the cornfield, he says, that's beautiful. And I had never taken a moment to just take a breath and experience what it was like to see it through a farmer's eyes. And since then, every year around that same time of year, as soon as the corn is tall, it's green, it hasn't quite gone brown yet, I try and look out at it and see the world through his eyes. And a couple life experiences, a couple big city experiences have taught me the Midwest and farming country, that's not a bad place to be, you know? So tell me a little bit more. So do you have any early memories on the farm? You say that you were, what we call that in the business is a gopher. Go for this, go for that, right?
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about what were some of your favorite jobs then as a kid? Like, what did it teach you? What kind of values did you get growing up in Northwest Iowa?
Yeah, I think it was, a hard work thing, that's for sure. Some things I can think about too as at an early age are those really cold days. The days when I was a first or second grader staying home from school and trying to make sure that the cattle waters were open, everybody was fed, moving snow, but also having a little bit of fun in there too.
Teaches you some priorities,
Yes,
doesn't it? Yeah,
exactly. And I just remember kind of, I have a lot of vivid memories of myself just kind of following my dad around, right? In some instances, especially with some of our younger calves, we were feeding by the bucket, right? I mean, using 5-gallon buckets, walking around, and I just remember, my dad carrying 4 around at a time, and me myself carrying my little bucket with just a little bit in it, just so that I'm kind of like a part of the process, right? And it's those sorts of lessons that I think have really translated and served me well, not just during my time on the farm throughout my life, but just beyond the farm as well.
I will say, I think that at least the farming communities that I've been blessed to be a part of, they have this care for young people that they seem willing to integrate them from a very young age in the process. And what young kid doesn't look at their dad as just their hero? And, I remember being a boy and like a young boy, and all you wanted to be was like dad, right?
Yes.
So the fact that, in other jobs, in my dad's job, right, I was able to maybe go in for one of those bring your kids to work day, but for a farmer, every kid is bring your kid to work day.
Yes.
And I think that that really is a blessing,
Right. Yeah, and I think too, that's our future, right? When you look at those kids, and whenever I make a trip to an auction or to a sale barn, and I see, a dad or a mom there with their 3 kids, you always have to smile. Right? Because that's the future of agriculture, and what a great way for me to grow up. And it's a joy to see other kids being able to have that same exact experience.
I would agree 100%. And what I also think is interesting, I've got nieces and nephews who are now in that, 3 to 6 age, is how excited they are about agriculture. And it kind of gives you a moment to reflect back on your own childhood. Like, I remember being so excited to get to go up in the tractor, or I remember the first time I got to climb the ladder on a combine and be up there with my Uncle Ron, right? And so those kind of experiences, they really are priceless, and I think they're limited because things do get busy. Eventually, you can't skip school as much because you might have a job after high school or that kind of thing. And, I think we'll get into a little bit more of that later, but it's a wonderful life. And I think the opportunity to take those moments while they're there is very important, to recognize them, to see them, and to seize
Realty
them.
and Land Management.
Right. And time
Pfeiffer's
can fly
offers
by
multiple
so
ways
fast.
to bid and buy at our equipment
All
and
right,
land
folks,
auctions.
for those of you
can bid
listening on the
online,
radio, that
in
little
person,
beeper means
or
our
place
segment is
pre-bids before the
over,
sale
but
even
we will be
starts.
back in our
By
second
providing
segment of
convenient
the
bidding
Legacy of
platforms, we
Agriculture.
make
Thanks
sure
for
that you
joining
can
us.
buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffer's.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Good Saturday morning, folks. This is the Legacy of Agriculture. I'm your host, Josh Erickson, today with my guest, Kendal Zylstra. I am a guest host for Chris Bear and pre-recording in WNAX Studios for this week's program. And today, Kendal and I are talking a little bit about both family history of farming, and then Kendal, you moved off the farm. You no longer are a farmer, is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, I come back a lot.
Well, does anybody ever stop being a farmer is maybe the question.
I don't think you ever do. It sticks with you, that's for sure.
You know, my mom grew up on a farm, and she works in the medical industry today, and she says that it's interesting watching as people's attitudes change towards you, whether that be in job interviews or even talking to patients over the phone, where when she says, yep, I grew up on a farm, it's like people... Oh, you know how to work. Yeah. Oh, you actually know what that takes.
The keys to the kingdom, per se. Yes.
Yeah. It is something else. And I tell you what, especially in today's world, if you're a farmer, you're going to work. You can't get out of it.
Yes.
You know? And I think that might have always been the case, but I can only speak to what our limited experience. So Kendal, we're going to jump into your family farm in just a moment, but what are you currently doing now? If you're not farming, right, you're not behind the plow, what is your career trajectory looking like?
So after going to college, I was kind of going back and forth as to what I wanted to do with my career, and I ended up going to law school. I really saw a shortage of attorneys, especially in rural areas, and it really kind of pushed me into doing something just a little bit different, you know. I decided I wasn't quite cut out for the farm, maybe as much as my brother was. My brother is just really into all things farming, and he's currently just recently graduated from high school. But
he's in hog farming, if I remember correctly,
yes,
right?
Yeah, so he works for a local hog farmer, does a lot of work for them, and then we also still have cattle around our farm as well, so he's pretty big on that. And yeah, he's just big into all aspects of agriculture and following those sorts of things. I think he's currently on a trajectory that he'd like to go into something animal nutrition related. So
he's the next guest I'll have on this show.
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. I'm sure you could talk him into that. Might have to give him a free cup of coffee or something.
Oh, yeah, that seems doable. So, yeah, well, that's wonderful. You know, here at the Legacy of Agriculture, we talk a lot with folks. Normally, I'm behind the camera, so I watch Chris talk a lot with folks.
Sure.
And one of the things that's very near and dear to our hearts is young folks in agriculture and what that looks like ultimately in a changing landscape, because the world of agriculture today is very different than it was 40 years ago.
True.
So any way that we can encourage any type of education, I mean, whether that be directly in the agriculture field, as your brother's doing raising animals, or in the law field where, you know, we've had guests like Thompson Law on who try and speak about estate planning, who can help folks in agriculture maximize their amount of earnings and the amount that they can pass down to their kids. We just support that 100%. So I think it's wonderful you being in law school, and I've got a tremendous amount of respect for you, especially because from the sounds of it, law school can be a little challenging at times.
It can be, but I think my work ethic has served me well.
That's good. That's good, man. So tell me a little bit more. We're going to get a little into your history of the Van Raalte farm, because I can learn from my mistakes. I'll pronounce it right this time. Tell me a little bit about what the history of that farm is like. I believe you said it was the 1900s or 1800s your family moved out there.
Yeah, it was around the 1910 point. I didn't actually pull out. I should have pulled out our documentation this morning, and I forgot to do that. But my great-great-grandparents were the ones who first bought the plot where my farm sits right now, and it's a little bit of a different shape, so it's about 220 acres, the original farm, and we've bought and sold land since then, but that's still the majority of what we farm. We're a relatively small operation. But when my great-great-grandparents came over, they got a loan for the land and started farming it. Well, the Depression days were relatively difficult for them.
So they got a loan for the land. This wasn't a stake or a claim or anything. This was
correct.
They were borrowing money after coming over so that they could purchase that.
Correct. And I believe that it already changed hands once or twice. I believe the railroad company originally owned a huge amount of that section of land there. But yeah, so they They moved over there around the 1910, probably just in the pre-World War I days. And when they came over there, they got a loan for it, and this would have been between Larchwood and Leicester, which is way up in the northwest corner of Iowa, not that far from Sioux Falls. But the Depression days were tough, and they ended up getting foreclosed on by the bank on 2 different occasions during the Depression era. So
most places, they can have trouble going through one of those. To survive 2 is a pretty impressive, it's a feat.
Right. Right.
You Zylstras must be bullheaded.
We must be. I don't know. But from what I know of my great-great-grandpa, he was just the type of guy who would tinker around with things. He always liked trying new things, new methods. And once they were able to get the farm back post-Depression, his last 20, 30 years before retirement were relatively productive in that he was able to kind of get the farm afloat and pass that along to my great-grandpa. So we would be a century farm today, but we lost it twice, so technically we don't have that. I think we're coming up on that probably in about 10 years or so.
So do you get to add all the years together? Because then you surpass it, right?
Correct.
It just depends on how you want to do your math.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe you shouldn't, because then in 10 years you have an excuse to celebrate, right? Yeah. Who doesn't like an excuse to party?
Exactly.
So now you had mentioned to me, we talked a little bit on the way down here, that after those Depression years, which were very tough on farms, I mean, very difficult.
Right.
That kind of determination that this is our area, we're going to make it. It wasn't the only factor in their success. One of them was innovation, in that
Yes.
You said that, I believe it was hog farming, is it great-grandfather?
Yes.
Or 2 greats?
Yes, my great-grandfather, Bill.
Okay.
Yeah, so he was a really early starter of farrowing all year round. So we were one of the first farms in our area that actually fully integrated electricity. And so that played a really major role in him being able to farrow year round and honestly sell at times when the market was much higher. Back then people would only farrow at certain times in the year, and so the markets would kind of sway with that. And so he kind of had a 10, 12-year period there where he was really able to excel with that. It was a lot of work, and it wasn't always easy, but he was able to do that and make it work, and that's really what kind of made the farm profitable. And that's why I was able to support multiple generations at once, because my great-great-grandpa, my great-grandpa, and then soon my grandpa were all farming together, either part-time or full-time. And so being able to sustain multiple families, that's kind of what they had to do.
Well, and I think it's interesting to me, we'll maybe get into this a little bit more in our next segment, how one innovation, electricity, right, which is a big innovation. Mind you, it's changed the course of human history, but that one innovation, for thousands of years, farming was done seasonally. And all of a sudden, with this invention, farming can change. Farming can happen, raising of livestock can happen at a different level than it used to. And I think today, even, we're seeing some of those same innovations that maybe 100 years from now people sit down and talk on their radio shows about.
Very well could be.
Yeah, what kind of things are changing. And we may ask a little bit later about what you see in the agriculture industry that might prove that. But folks, we're coming down to the end of our second segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. I'm your host this week, Josh Erickson, and I'm here with Kendal Zylstra. Kendal Zylstra is a Northwest farm kid and soon-to-be lawyer. And so Kendal is my guest today. Before we leave this section, we want to give a big shout-out to our sponsor. Our sponsor this week is Pfeiffer's Auction and Realty. Pfeiffer's auctions land all across the Midwest and has equipment auctions all across the Midwest. They do an absolutely wonderful job, and so we want to just give them a shout-out and a thank you. If you have machinery or land you would like to sell or land you would like managed, give them a call at 605-836-2277. That phone number, again, is 605-836-2277. We'll be right back with the show, folks.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pifers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pifers. Nobody does it better.
Good Saturday morning, folks. This is your host of the Legacy of Agriculture, Josh Erickson. I am guest hosting for Chris Baer this week, and I am here with my guest, Kendal Zylstra. Kendal Zylstra is a Northwest Iowa farm kid. He, like me, is a fellow Dutchman, and he has grown up on a farm and since moved out of the farming world, but taken a lot of those lessons with him. So, Kendal, last section we talked a lot about your family history of the farm, right? The Van Roltes and how they held on to the farm with determination and with innovation to continue that legacy, right? To hold on to it, and you said to support multiple generations at once, which is really, it's quite the feat.
Right.
The next thing that I would have to ask is, what was it like by the time that little, or maybe not so little, you're a Dutchman, you're a tall guy, Kendal was running around. You were in high school when we first met, so I believe we met in 7th grade at a church camp, and we participated in small groups together. But then freshman year, you transferred to a Christian school in Sioux Falls.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit about that time period, right? I remember when I was that age, I was concerned with my jobs in town, right, which consisted of working as a cashier or working at a couple separate movie theaters. But tell me a little bit about what life was like for a teenager on the farm in the 2010s.
Yeah. I had a lot of diverse experiences. So I was involved with 4-H. So that kind of provided me a network with a lot of other farmers in the area. Some of the things that I did while I was in my junior high or high school years where we had a hog nursery on the farm and we took care of pigs for a neighbor. That was kind of my designated project for a while. So spent a lot of time doing that.
A hog nursery.
Correct.
So you're raising just the baby pigs.
Just the baby pigs.
Gotcha. How did you like that job?
I think it was really good, especially for my age, and that number one, they weren't as large, which I think was big, especially when, I'm 11, 12 years old. But I think it really, learning from my dad as well as my grandpa and my mom too, who was very involved on the farm, they were just very meticulous and very specific in that, we were a smaller operation. The hog nursery that we had at that time, I would guess we probably never had more than 200 pigs in there at once. So it wasn't very large at all.
Okay, see, you say that as not large, but you got to remember, my household was 3 older brothers, myself, and my parents in the middle of town. 200 pigs sounds pretty large to a city kid, right?
Sure.
So that's a small hog nursery.
Very, very, very small. And after a while, it just kind of became not really worth it, honestly, to continue. But we kind of would generally get the 200 worst straight into the nursery.
Okay.
So our job was kind of to really, truly nurse them up a little bit. And oftentimes my grandpa took pride in that the people that we took care of those hogs for, a lot of times ours would come out weighing more than what the good ones did in other nurseries. And just that, very meticulous, watching every single pig, caring for that, pulling ones aside if we needed to. Our mortality loss was extremely low, and a lot of paying attention to those sorts of details were really important and instrumental in my development as a person, not just in the agriculture world, but in general. Some of the other things I did was loading hogs for other neighbors, those sorts of things as well.
I heard this phrase from Chris, and I believe he said it on the show before, that $1 million potatoes, or how was it? Expensive potatoes have broke more millionaires than they've made. That's how it is. Because when times are good, it's easy to think times are going to continue being good. But I think a lot of success in the ag industry, especially because it is seasonal, it's cyclical.
Correct.
Comes from what you're talking about there, the ability to look at how do we improve these efficiencies? How do we make sure that this area where things are more difficult, how do we make that more successful? How do we make that a strength instead of a weakness? And the ability to anticipate those, really it does, I think it can make or break a farmer, you know? So to hear something like that, I would agree 100% with you that those details matter, right? And the ability to
Yes.
look at them matters.
Right. Right. And how you look at them, too. I mean, when I think of some of the years growing up that were not great farming years, it's, looking ahead, what you can do to innovate. And that's who my grandpa was. That's who my great grandpa was, always finding ways to innovate, finding ways to change.
And I think that it's an interesting world we live in that people aren't naturally, they don't enjoy change, right? And I'm no exception, I really am not. But I think also the ability to be adaptable, especially in today's world of changing technology, is very important. I talked with a rep from John Deere while I was at the office. This was a while ago, and they explained that they have full-time computer technicians. Their only job is to go out into the field and diagnose computer issues on machinery. And as someone who maybe struggles even with mechanical things, I thought that was hilarious because, it's just to not be able to run a combine because the computer's down. That's kind of funny to me. But it's led to these tremendous efficiencies. I mean, our yields continue to increase, and people are able to produce more with less input labor. And when it works, it works. I mean, technology is wonderful when it works.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, Kendal, I think we're going to get into a little bit more of your choice you were on the farm and raising pigs, and then after high school, you went to college at Dordt University, I believe?
I did,
Dordt
yes.
College at the time.
Correct, yes.
Gotcha. So
Since been renamed.
You got to witness the historic change.
Yes, big time.
Yeah, that's funny. But after Dordt, you were between Dordt College and now Drake Law School, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
You went into politics and you had a foray into there. And I kind of want to talk a little bit about that, but we are coming down to the end of our third segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. So before we get into that, we'll get into Kendal's political career and how politics affect farmers. And we'll do that in our next segment. But before we do, I want to give one more shout out to our sponsor, Pfeiffer's Auction and Realty. Pfeiffer's Auction and Realty and Land Management, they manage and auction off land all across the Midwest. If you want to hear about the many auctions they have coming up this spring, you want to give them a phone call at 605-836-2277 or go to their website at pfeifers.com. That's PIFERS.com. We'll be right back, folks.
Hi, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeifers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeifers. Nobody does it better.
Good Saturday morning, folks. This is the Legacy of Agriculture. I am your host, Josh Erickson. I am guest hosting for Chris Bear. Chris Bear is not able to pre-record this Saturday morning, so I am stepping in with my guest, Kendal Zylstra, a Northwest farm kid. Kendal and I have had a wonderful first three segments, and to be honest with you, Kendal, it's always great to have an excuse to talk to you. I know we're a couple of chatterboxes. We drove down to Yankton together today, and I think we talked the whole time, so it's always nice to have an excuse. And hey, if we can sit down and make other people listen to our stuff, then why not? So now, Kendal, you have kind of a unique experience, and that's one of the reasons why when Chris asked me to find a guest, you were one of my first calls, is because you grew up on a farm. And then following college at a very, very young age, you made a run for state senate in the great state of Iowa. And you and I have actually, I went down and saw you in Des Moines. We saw the state capitol down there. Beautiful building. Absolutely gorgeous. And so while you were looking at serving in that building now, if I remember correctly, it was a pretty close race between you and your opponent. And I believe he was successful. But I'd like to talk a little bit about why the choice for a young person to get into politics. And the reason why is because I think a lot of young people today are very discouraged by the political landscape. And again, as a disclaimer, Legacy of Agriculture isn't a political show, so we do not take a stance on on these issues. We leave that up to our listeners. We believe that you are educated. You are able to form your own opinions. The last thing you need is us telling you what to think. But I do want to ask about what the reasoning behind you getting into politics. What gave you that, I guess, maybe optimism?
Sure. Yeah, you could call it optimism, but I think definitely, like you alluded to, there's a lot of young people that feel a little bit left out. But I think the big thing, though, is really my background in agriculture. I think a lot of the feedback that I got from people while I was running was just kind of an overall frustration in that they don't feel like a lot of people listen and pay attention to agriculture issues. And that was something I wanted to highlight, And
it does seem like, though, that we've got a lot of people talking as if they do.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I think there's a lot of people who want to pay lip service to the agriculture industry.
I would agree.
But when it comes to actual issues, and regardless of what your position is on those issues, they're not even engaging with them. They're sort of just paying lip service to them. So a lot of my focus when I was running was really around those sorts of groups, agriculture groups. So I spent a lot of time speaking at Farm Bureau related events, local county pork producer, county cattleman meetings, those sorts of things. Went to a lot of times too, I just go to local elevators where there'd be 2 or 3 guys sitting around having a cup of coffee. That's what I did to campaign, because I think it's really a grassroots effort. And I think my passion for agriculture really showed. I ran for state house in Iowa in a district where the largest city was Sioux Center. So,
the bustling metropolis of Sioux Center.
Exactly. I had one Walmart in my district, right? So It's a lot, where I was running is a lot different, and I would argue a lot better, maybe I'm a little biased.
I'm sure, yeah.
Than maybe a suburban seat would be, And so being focused around agriculture, which was exactly my background, the area where I was raised, that's where I think my passion showed, and that's why I was nearly successful as a 21-year-old kid running for State House of Representatives.
Well, I think one of the beauties of our government that is parted out the way that it is, right? Our federal government, our state governments, our local governments,
yes.
that it's a tiered system, is that if you're living in Des Moines, as you currently are, the issues that you face on a daily basis are different than the issues you faced maybe when you were in high school living on the farm.
Correct.
And that doesn't make one or the other more important. It just means that we have to handle things differently. In that, I think it's unfair to say that the rules for the city should be universally applied to the rules for the farm, or vice versa.
Correct.
Nobody moves
Absolutely.
to a city in the hopes that they can, what is it you said, have a 200-head hog nursery next to
Right.
them? That's not what you want if you're living in the suburbs.
Correct.
Yeah. So I think that that's very important. But the idea of actually listening to the folks on the ground, I 100% support. I mean, we are ultimately a government by the people, and trying to be out talking with the people is very important.
Right.
So what did that teach you as far as running on a more maybe agricultural ticket? What did that teach you specifically about agriculture? What did you learn about farming and farmers, having this opportunity to go out and speak with them and to hopefully represent them?
Yeah, I think it helped me learn a lot about other areas. So, for example, I didn't grow up on a dairy, but I learned a lot more about the dairy world than what I did before.
It's something else, isn't it?
It is. And, actually through my time with legal work throughout law school, I've now been exposed to the dairy world a lot more. And now I can kind of start to speak the language a little bit. Whereas, I grew up in a beef and pork family. That was basically all we did. So being able to diversify a little bit, but also identify some of the crucial conversations that need to be had. Whether we're talking about the future of biofuels or the future of whatever industry or sub-industry within the agriculture industry we're talking about. It's those sorts of things that we need to engage and think about the future. And we can have different perspectives, but I think it's really important to have the conversation. And I think that's what's a lot of times left out by our current political climate.
I would agree 100%. And agriculture is such a big umbrella. I mean, and even just through the experience of standing behind a camera for this show, right? I have witnessed people from implement dealerships to people working on automatic feed trucks to day operators to people who are on century farms to now almost century farms to lawyers planning, estate planning. The world of agriculture, everybody needs to eat. And so it really is, it's interwoven in all of our daily lives.
Right.
And I think that's truly amazing. And so the ability to, like you say, speak the language, that's very, very important, to be able to sit down and have those conversations in a civil manner. Well, Kendal, we're coming up towards the end of our final segment, and I do want to ask you before we close out for today. There's a lot of young people and a lot of older folks listening to us who are in farming. I want to ask kind of a unique question. Normally we ask, if you're a young person, how can you get into the ag industry? But you're a young person who's kind of moved out of the ag industry. So how would you, as someone who's gone through that, encourage young people to stay connected to ag? And how would you encourage them to use their skills outside of agriculture to uplift the agriculture industry?
Yeah, I would say two things come to mind. First of all, just staying involved with the same organizations you're with. I enjoy getting to know people in various, pork producer. The Iowa pork producers are great. I enjoy getting along with them. But the second thing that I would say too is don't let it fall away from you. Let it become a part of you. And the reason I say that is when I talk to a lot of people in local Midwestern cities, whether that be Sioux Falls, Sioux City, Omaha, Des Moines, it seems like a lot of the people who used to be one generation removed from the farm are now 2 and 3 generations removed from the farm. And I think that in general, that's something that you need to let stick with you. And I think finding ways to help other people be exposed to that farm culture is really important.
Well, and we do love the agriculture culture here on this show, and that's part of the reason why we started it, is to preserve some of these stories, especially as we live in a changing world.
Very true.
And so those kind of things I think are very, very encouraging. And things like going to farmers markets, things like educating our children so they know where their food comes from. And if you're a farmer, things like opening your farms for things like tours so that people can see the process from field to table, I think are
Absolutely.
they're essential for our education as a society. So,
right.
Kendal, I want to thank you again for being my guest on the Legacy of Agriculture today. We want to give one more great big shout out to our sponsor, Pfeiffer's Auction and Realty. If you have land or machinery you would like to sell, give them a call at 605-836-2277, or you can go to their website at pfeifers.com. Kendal, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you.
Been on here now, who bid $500,000 bid.
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Legacy of Agriculture with Chris Bear, sponsored by Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Call Pfeiffer's at 605-836-2277.